What's the longest you've ever waited for a video game sequel? Devil Summoner Soul Hackers was released all the way back in 1997 on the Sega Saturn, a first-person dungeon crawler JRPG made by developer Atlus. 4 console generations later, we finally have a sequel, Soul Hackers 2, though it's really a standalone game with mostly thematic connections to the original. 25 years is a long time in computer graphics, and Soul Hackers 2 has a wide variety of tech that it could potentially use, but early footage hasn't exactly impressed. So does it make effective use of modern rendering staples? And if not, can it at least deliver smooth performance across current gen and last gen console platforms? Soul Hackers 2 borrows its gameplay elements from other recent Atlus titles. At a basic level, this is a turn-based RPG oriented around exploiting weaknesses, which proves to be an enjoyable enough system, but nothing out of the ordinary for RPG veterans. There are some twists, like an overkill-style mechanic that rewards strategic play, and plenty of customization, but this isn't especially novel. Elsewhere, however, this game really shines. Soul Hackers 2 is a party-oriented title that weaves multiple characters through a winding, serialized story. Interpersonal conflicts and interactions take center stage here, and a social system gamifies out-of-combat interactions, giving simple conversations actual consequences. It's more like a TV show than a movie, with a villain of the week style narrative that features multiple short story arcs that build over time. This general formula is fairly novel by industry standards, but if you've played other Atlus RPGs, particularly Persona 5 or Tokyo Mirage Sessions, you'll know what to expect. That fortunately extends to the rest of the package as well, with a keen sense of visual style. Menus feature angular motifs defined by sharp trapezoids and triangles, with bold color and fonts. Character portraits have a bit of a hand-drawn style to them, with grainy line work and a touch of paint texture. The character models prove a close match for their illustrated counterparts, with sharp proportions and the same fine detailing. Combat animations really pop, with plenty of exaggeration and fast movement, accentuated with an accumulation blur effect and chromatic aberration. But you can't make a video game out of artistic flourishes alone. So how does the 3D rendering hold up? Let's start with the good stuff. On the plus side, the 3D character models are reasonably high in graphical fidelity. They feature suitably high polygon counts, have good texture work, and are smoothly cel-shaded. The character rendering itself isn't state-of-the-art, but it doesn't need to be, and it works perfectly well here given the visual style. But the environments that those character models find themselves in really expose the rendering weaknesses in this game. 8th gen staples like physically based materials, global illumination, and screen space reflections seem to be entirely absent, but that's just the start. All of the environmental lighting seems to be baked, and doesn't affect shadow casting at all. The geometry budget is quite limited, which produces chunky looking curved surfaces. Texture resolution is questionable, and there's minimal texture variety. Cube maps are remarkably simple and poorly aligned. Post-processing is limited as well, as the game lacks per-pixel motion blur and bokeh depth of field effects. Soul Hackers 2 runs on the Unity game engine, without the high-definition render pipeline feature set, so I didn't expect technique-level parity with advanced software. But the results here are very basic and aren't very far ahead of PS3 and Xbox 360 titles. It feels particularly odd given the platform targets for this project: PS4, Xbox One, PS5, Xbox Series, and PC, which are all perfectly capable of handling more ambitious assets at the very least. Comparing Soul Hackers 2 with Atlus's last game really highlights these issues. Shin Megami Tensei 5 shipped last year on the Nintendo Switch, and shares many elements with Soul Hackers 2, including many of the enemy models. But despite the limited hardware power inside the Switch, the rendering techniques there are much more mature, and assets are generally higher grade. Differences in game engine are certainly part of the picture here, but they aren't the whole story. It's safe to say that I'm not thrilled with the rendering makeup of Soul Hackers 2, but there's an even more conspicuous problem with the visuals in my opinion. Soul Hackers 2 has very basic environmental artwork for the most part. Dungeons consist of samey looking corridors in barren, industrial style environments, like shipyards and subway terminals. There's little to distinguish one room from the next, with copy and paste corridors and flat lighting. Each dungeon might have a small handful of room designs and hallway features, which are repeated ad nauseum over the course of hours and hours of gameplay. Thankfully, there is a mini-map that you can access while exploring, otherwise it would be extremely easy to get lost. Perhaps some of this lack of variety comes down to project scope. Atlus produces long, complex RPGs with relatively modest staffing, which leads to certain concessions in most of their games. For instance, most dialogue scenes are handled primarily through voiceover and expressive character portraits, with the actual 3D models mostly cycling through idle animations. Other Atlus titles, Persona 5 in particular, have showcased much more detailed dungeon designs, however, and I think a little bit of work could have gone a long way here. The game's city areas do look decent, however. These zones are admittedly pretty small, and the rendering foibles still annoy. But if the dungeons had something closer to this level of care and attention to detail, there would be a lot less to complain about. Image quality is, perhaps not surprisingly, behind the curve as well, and that's because there's no anti-aliasing whatsoever. The relative lack of geometry ironically helps a little bit here, minimizing visible aliasing in some scenes. Still, expect a shimmery presentation. Even high rendering resolutions don't fix the problem. PS5 and Series X both offer two rendering modes, labeled Prioritize Performance and Prioritize Graphics. The graphics mode delivers a 4K treatment on both machines with a full 3840 by 2160 grid. The performance modes dip somewhat, dropping to 3200 by 1800, but neither offers an especially clean image relative to the TAA treated fare that we're used to, and there are a lot of jagged edges on display. Comparing the two options side by side, there's an obvious image quality delta between the two modes, magnified by the lack of any sort of image treatment. 1800p and 2160p aren't particularly far apart in pixel count, but scaling a raw 1800p image to a 4K set produces obvious artifacts. Plus, the UI is rendered at the same resolution as 3D screen elements, so at 1800p fine details in text and on character portraits look a little bit blurrier. Outside of resolution, however, there don't seem to be any other graphical differences. All of the aforementioned problems are much worse on Series S. Here, resolution gets cut down to 2048 by 1152, just fractionally above 1080p, with no mode selections. There's plenty of aliasing to go around, and the image looks rather chunky. Plus, 2D elements look slightly questionable on a 4K screen at this relatively low rendering resolution. This sort of pixel count is par for the course on Series S, but again the lack of image treatment makes it look worse than it should. On PS5 and Series X, the two rendering modes on offer deliver 30fps and 60fps frame rate targets respectively. The graphics modes on both consoles deliver a straight 30fps update without any deviance, though the lack of motion blur makes the game look a little bit less smooth in motion than most other 30fps titles. In heavy combat scenes and in busy city areas, I couldn't get the game to drop at all, so this seems like a locked 4K 30 for all intents and purposes. On PS5, the performance mode hits 60fps almost all of the time. The only exception really comes down to certain screen-filling attacks during combat, namely the breath attacks that emit a high density of alpha particles. You'll often notice a brief clutch of dropped frames while these attacks are on screen. Outside of that, however, the game locks to 60fps, which feels quite a bit more fluid than the graphics mode. Series X doesn't fare nearly as well with this option enabled. The brief dips during combat return, though as before this is a fairly minor issue. The game really struggles in certain city areas, however, dropping into the 40s and 50s for extended periods. Certain cutscenes see prolonged performance dips as well. The combat issues are understandable, but the other problems don't make as much sense. The same woes reappear on the Series S. 60fps is again the framerate target here, though combat cutscenes in city areas all cause issues at times, and the performance drops are in line with the Series X. Relative to Series X, it is a reasonable showing, as the Series S offers similar frame rates at about 40% of the overall pixel count, but the drops outside of combat do feel odd. After thoroughly testing Soul Hackers 2 on current-gen platforms and writing most of this video, I did a handful of checks just to see if I was missing anything important. The last thing on my list was to see if there was anything interesting about the last-gen console versions, which I wasn't planning to cover and expected would be fairly straightforward. And wow. Starting on Xbox One S, the performance is miserable. Soul Hackers 2 tends to run between 15 and 35 FPS here, with city environments in particular proving extremely taxing. Most cutscenes hang in the 20s, while combat fluctuates wildly. For some reason, Atlus has elected for an uncapped framerate here, which feels totally unsuitable for these framerates. Perhaps the 1080p rendering resolution is partly to blame, though with these visuals it's hard to see where the bottleneck is coming from. Performance tanks further when fast-forwarding through cutscene sequences, down to lows in the single digits, though other last-gen machines do have problems here, just not quite as bad. The Xbox One X fares somewhat better. The unlocked framerate is back, but performance is improved by about 5 to 10 FPS and similar gameplay, and resolution is quadrupled to a full 4K. This would work alright with a 30 FPS cap most of the time, though excursions into the low to mid 20s are still far too common for my taste. PS4 is the first last-gen machine that actually manages to turn out sort of consistent performance. We can still push the machine to lows around 20 FPS in certain scenes, but critically a 30 FPS framerate cap is actually in place. We're getting a 1080p resolution, just like Xbox One, but with performance lows closer to the One X, and with a properly frame-paced 30 FPS ceiling to boot. PS4 Pro takes a punt on resolution, rendering at 1080p without any visual boosts over the PS4 code. But performance is very, very close to a locked 30 FPS, with only the challenging Karachuko environment causing any issues. Of all the last-gen machines, this is definitely the one to go for. Atlus's decisions with Soul Hackers 2 seem very odd here. Why leave the Xbox Ones uncapped? Why run the One X at 4K and PS4 Pro at 1080p? I'm genuinely befuddled. Even though the game seems inexplicably heavy, the configuration issues on last-gen machines just make a bad situation worse. I'm of two minds about Soul Hackers 2. The game itself is very good, combining strong characters, a satisfying combat system, and excellent music. It's very much in line with other Atlus titles, and while it probably isn't as polished or expansive as a game like Persona 5, this is a solid game for people who like these kinds of titles. Plus, there are visual elements that do hold up very well, namely the 2D artwork, animations, character models, and menus. The graphics, however, are simply well below par. The rendering tech is primitive in just about every respect, though it's something that can be mostly overlooked once you get used to it. But the dungeon assets are offensively basic, with ugly copy-pasted corridors all over the game's combat sections. And the game has some troubling performance issues on most console platforms, with the Xbox One S in particular exhibiting some of the worst frame rates I've seen in recent times. As a modern, full-price release, Soul Hackers 2 falls below just about every technical standard. But if you're otherwise interested in this title, it is worth playing, as long as you keep visual expectations in check. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, just use Twitter. Thanks for watching.